We have, in 2025, just celebrated the 200th anniversary of the modern railway, 200 years since the opening of the Stockton and Darlington line. Over the past 2 centuries, steam has in turn given way to diesel and electric. But thankfully there are still thousands of steam locomotives still around to show us how train travel has evolved. However, you might not have realised that there was actually a time when steam was outright banned from being run on British railways, and that very nearly could have been how things could have stayed. In today's instalment of Guide Rail, we'll be combining the Rail 200 celebrations with the spooky month of October, as we look at the British Railways steam ban. The end of steam is a melancholic age, where in the 1950s and 60s, the use of these iron giants was phased out. Well, it's an ironic phrase really, as we're here in the 21st century with hundreds of working examples, proving that the age of steam traction is alive and well, if not at a slower pace of life. In post-war Britain, nobody was to know that, as the January 1955 modernisation plan had seen BR desperate to create a more sleek appearance to their network. This included hastily replacing steam locomotives for new but often problematic diesels, and electrifying several core routes. The second blow had been the reshaping of British Railways report of March 1963. Leading to the closure of thousands of stations and the tracks that led to them. With new propulsion to pull the trains, and less places that trains could go to, the era of the steam locomotive was ominously numbered. It was simply a sign of a changing world, regardless of the nostalgia for these living and breathing machines. It was also just as much about public image as it was about trying to recover financial losses. Around the world, several other nations had already made the move to make diesels the mainstay on their networks, so Britain didn't want to be left behind. Indeed, being the land that invented the railway, some of the steam engines still at work dated as far back as 1872, still in revenue-earning service at 90 years of age. This wasn't the case for all locomotives though, as the new Riddle standard classes were still being constructed up to 1960. They were built to last right into the 1980s at least, but a change of mind from the government meant that was not to be, and many were sent to the scrapyards only a handful of years after they were ordered. By 1968, there were only 359 steam engines left. It should be noted that there were actually even more early diesel and electric locomotives that were withdrawn in the same year, over 750 in total, as the entire rail network was cut down to the absolute basics. With all that said, August 1968 became the last goodbye to steam. It had already been a year since the last express service had been led by a steam engine, and it was now only the Midland region that had a handful of mainline locomotives still puffing away. Almost all of these were Stanier Black 5s and 8Fs, workhorses of the rails, with a few standard tender engines in ever-dwindling numbers. The 3rd of August had seen the last regular passenger train, and a week later a grand farewell was planned for the final use of mainline steam altogether. Train 1T57. This became known as the 15 Guinea Special, after the extraordinarily high price to travel on the train. The special ran over the Liverpool and Manchester Railway route of 1830, hauled by Black 5 45110. Then Standard 7 Oliver Cromwell took over up the Settle and Carlisle line. From Carlisle, the tour was double-headed by two more Black 5s back to Manchester, confusingly numbered 44871 and 44781. Lastly, 45110 took the train back to the start, becoming known as the last engine in service. It actually gained this title by chance, covering for the failed 45407. Likewise, Britannia was the preferred loco for the train, but Oliver Cromwell had been the last engine to receive a heavy overhaul, so was chosen because it was more mechanically fit. You would think that as a grand hurrah for a legacy lasting over 140 years, more famous names would have been chartered for this very last train. The fact that 3 mixed traffic engines and 1 standard Pacific were chosen really shows the limited choice for what was left. All but one of the 4 15 Guinea engines are preserved today. 44781 would later be used as a derailed prop for the 1969 film The Virgin Soldiers. It was actually purchased to be saved, but the buyer could not afford the cost to move the engine, so sadly it was cut up where it stood. Very much the one that got away. The symbolic significance of the 15 Guinea Special is that it was the last steam-hauled train, and British Railways were very serious about this. The following day, Monday the 12th of August 1968, a ban on the use of steam locomotives was introduced. As discussed, this was partly due to public image, as the sight of these grimy, worn-out engines simply dragged the company back to the Victorian age. Even the British Transport Commission's museum collection in Clapham was being considered to be disposed of elsewhere. Thankfully, the items here would go on to form what is now the National Railway Museum. In the age when the advanced passenger train was being developed, these relics of the past were not what the company wanted to be known by. Secondly, it was much more economical to outright stop the use of steam in one go, instead of keeping facilities open for a select few. So down came the coaling towers, the ash pits and the water stands. Turntables were filled in, and runaround loops taken away. That is how our rail network looks today, equipped much more for the efficient multiple units instead, with freight services hauled by diesel electrics. The railways may have been built for the use of steam, but the infrastructure to cater for this is long gone. And that all started from the steam ban of 1968. Clearly though, it didn't last forever. So what happened? Firstly, don't be mistaken into thinking that this was an enforced law. It was just a strategic decision by British Railways. It's like upgrading to Windows 11. Even though all of the support has gone for earlier versions, it's not illegal to still use Windows 10. BR had upgraded to diesels, and they didn't want to keep their routes accessible to Steam if they didn't have a future using them, so they just weren't allowed to be used at all. Having said that, as I can hear the angry comments typing, well, actually, yes, there were a few exceptions to this rule. Until 1989, there were still 3 steam engines still employed in revenue-earning service, those being the trio of tank engines on the Vale of Rydal Railway. Operating at this point as a tourist line, no funds were ever allocated to replacing them. So they quietly kept going into the branding of the BR Double Arrow. The line was eventually sold to private ownership and continues running today, with number 9 now returned to its BR Blue. The Rydal was very much an anomaly in the system, as the only narrow gauge line under BR's logo, but was kept going as it was just about socially essential enough to the local community. Furthermore, the steam ban only applied to stock owned by British Railways, and not to external companies that connected to it. For instance, industrial firms that had their own engines, like the National Coal Board, were still using designs like the austerity tanks. The last of these engines was actually built in 1964, long after 9F Evening Star. Another noteworthy example is London Transport, who kept using pannier tanks on engineering trains until June 1971. At this point, of course, the scrapping of so many railway lines and rolling stock had led to the formation of many heritage groups. Volunteer-run lines were becoming far more common by the late 1960s, where ex-BR engines were able to run again. Some salvaged from the scrapyard, some bought straight in working condition. In cases such as this, engines would often be dragged by a diesel for light engine movements. They would still have to be kept in steam, but only with a warming fire to enable the lubrication systems to be kept working, and generally not with enough pressure to move. Whether this counts as breaking the steam ban is up to you. For most of these preserved lines, there's a limit of 25 miles an hour. So, all those years ago, it must have seemed that the ban had succeeded in wiping out all hope of seeing a train at speed. All except for one. The idea of privately buying and running a steam engine on a preserved railway is now quite accepted. But to run one on mainline tours was unthinkable in the 1960s. To do that would require someone with insider knowledge, and connections to the transport industry to permit that to happen. On top of that, public opinion was not always in favour of preserving working items. Even Sir Nigel Grosley's daughter voiced her opinion that she would prefer to see Flying Scotsman given a dignified retirement, rather than exploited on runs to Scotland. Others didn't share that view. Alan Pegler was a member of the Eastern Region Railway Board, and was forward-thinking enough to strike a deal when he purchased Flying Scotsman in 1963. He signed and later extended a contract that would authorise 4472 to operate on the main line until the end of 1971. British Railways were furious that this had been approved, as it meant that Flying Scotsman was legally allowed to bypass the steam ban. This again asserted the engine's unmatched levels of fame. It is partly why enthusiasts were so against Flying Scotsman being sent to the USA in 1969, as it had become the only engine that was still to be found on rail tours. The pressures of running excursions in Britain had also got to Pegler, who had even fitted a second tender to overcome the lack of water towers now remaining. He also wasn't permitted to drive the engine himself under UK law, so a tour of the United States seemed appealing where the rules were less severe. Because of this, for 1 year, there was no mainline steam to be found. In 1970, Flying Scotsman looked ever more unlikely to return to the UK, and even if it did, the contract to allow it to run would likely not be renewed. For the second time, it looked like that was the end of steam, and so we raise a toast to that. Cider, specifically. Peter Pryor, managing director of H.P. Bulmer's Cider in Hereford, decided to open a visitor centre along the goods yard at their brewery. He agreed with Swindon Council to loan GWR King George V, which ran with specially repainted Pullman cars along the sidings. The aim was, from the start, to run promotional excursions, but the steam ban meant that these were diesel-hauled anywhere beyond the sidings. Bulmer's and the 6000 Locomotive Association didn't give up though. When Richard Marsh took over as BR chairman in 1971, they asked again. Perhaps it helped that this was not a train run on behalf of railway enthusiasts, but as a marketing campaign for a well-known brand. Either way, they were granted permission to return the King to the big railway. From the 2nd of October, the return to steam excursion ran over 4 days across the western region, travelling to Tyseley, Birmingham, Swindon, and even back to the capital. Many flocked back to the line side to see the express engine returning home. It was a sight that many did not expect to see again, and the Bulmer's Cider train may not have been the way they expected to see it. Regardless, these special trains proved that there may be a future for privately run services over the British Rail network. 1972 saw consideration for a few more steam journeys. But in just 3 years, the parameters for what allowed steam to run had significantly changed. British Railways needed a way of regulating the safety standards of these private trains, and we'll talk about these conditions in a future guide rail. What's important today is to highlight how lucky we are that steam is permitted on the mainline at all in the 21st century. If it wasn't for technicalities like 3 narrow gauge locos being officially owned by BR, the age of steam at work would have officially ended in 1968. If it weren't for clauses in Flying Scotsman's contract, there would have been no engines to counteract the imposed steam ban. And if it weren't for Bulmer's Cider train, there would not have been a leading example to prove that volunteer-run groups could operate their own locomotives on the national network. Throughout the UK today, dozens of heritage steam, diesel and electric rail tours travel every year, to more and more destinations. This was made easier when British Railways was privatised from 1994, as now independent companies could be formed to run services throughout the nation. There are ever-increasing complications with operating these vintage vehicles in the present day, but at least there are examples to prove that it can be done. Of course, having a strong army of heritage railways does help significantly, but it is a wonder how different things could have been if the steam ban of 1968 had remained in place. Nobody was to know that it would only last for 3 years, but over 50 years on, there's more than enough steam engines still out doing what they were built to do, long after the age of steam had supposedly ended. Thank you for watching this instalment of Guide Rail, where we discuss the wonders of our steam-powered history. Do consider subscribing to the channel or joining at patreon.com/Terrier55Stepney to get a bunch of exclusive rewards for supporting the channel. One of those includes I read out your name at the end of every video as a thanks in the credits. Sort of like this. This video was thanks to the following channel patrons: Alex Goodman, GBH Train, D0280 Falcon, Sean Tempest, Random Thomas Fan, Dark White 73, Andrew Dyack, Reese Lee Walter, Ryan RTS, Ewan Pentland, Steam Power 4472, Jude 72, Firewind 10, Luneacres Photography, Mario Sonic 64, Elias, TJOC 9891, Tamsy, Insane Edward, SB Track Tales, and Eisenstag 04.